Story 1. Christmas 2013. The mysterious Barbie doll from my murdered sister. Christmas of 2013 started as a very special one for me and my young family. My wife and I had recently moved into our starter home with our 4-year-old son, and it marked our first Christmas in a house of our very own. To mark the occasion and show off the new place a little, my wife not only decked our halls with bowls of holly among other things, she organized an extensive list of holiday visitors featuring an all-star cast of our friends, family, and new neighbors. First, we had my wife's side of the family come over in early December. We'd spent Christmas with them the previous year, and since we wanted to enjoy our first holiday season in the new house, we made arrangements to have dinner and swap gifts during that first weekend of the month. They arrived in force too. Her parents, her siblings, her cousins, and all the associated offspring showed up with anyone over 5, carrying a Christmas gift for our 4-year-old boy. He was still very much the baby of the family at that point, as all of his cousins were fast approaching middle school. So when I say my wife's side of the family wanted to spoil him, you can trust that they spoiled him pretty good. They left quite a pile of gift-wrapped boxes under our tree, and most of them were addressed to our son. But I appreciated that more than any gift they could have gotten me. And next up were some old college buddies of ours. My wife and I met during our time at LSU, so we shared quite a large group of mutual friends. And then, the weekends after her family came over, we welcomed them over for drinks and dinner. 7 of them showed up, all bearing gifts. And just like my wife's family, they seemed intent on spoiling our young son. The pile under our Christmas tree grew even larger, and there was something so magical about having something that you might see on the cover of a Christmas card, right there in your own home. You see, during my childhood, Christmas wasn't a particularly joyous time of year, not for my family anyway. I remember having a few years of Merry Christmases with my mom, myself, and my little sister, all opening up presents on Christmas morning. And then, in 1994, when I was just about to turn 8, my sister passed away under tragic circumstances, and things were never the same again. Christmas became an incredibly painful time of year, particularly for my mom, who'd taken to drinking to dull the pain of my sister's loss. Other kids looked forward to the holidays, but I didn't, because despite everything my aunts, uncles, and grandparents did for us around that time of year, it was still hell on my mom and dad. Despite many years of trying, none of us ever really got over it. Mom let the booze get the better of her, and her health declined rapidly, and Dad stuck by her till the very end, and then died of a heart attack on the 4th anniversary of her death. From 16 to 18, I lived with my aunt, pouring myself into my schoolwork by way of an escape. And it was only during my senior year of college that I actually started to feel some semblance of normalcy again, almost like how the feeling returns to your arm or leg after it's fallen asleep. My wife and I have been dating since our senior year of college, but it wasn't until we were engaged to be married that I told her about my past. I told her about the slow death of my mother, the sudden death of my father, and the tragic circumstances in which my sister passed. And I bared my soul, and she still accepted me for who I was. And after that, there's never been a single day that I've questioned my decision to marry her. She understood better than anyone that Christmases past had been very painful for me, and that the key to dealing with that trauma was to turn Christmases present into occasions of light, laughter, and love. Seeing all those presents under our tree wasn't simply a generous gesture toward young parents. It was fixing me, one gift-wrap box at a time. And as I said earlier, my wife had quite the visitor's schedule laid out for us. Once we'd spent the weekend with her family, we still had arrangements with my cousins, a group of family friends we hadn't seen in a while, as well as groups of our respective co-workers who all stopped by for eggnog and Christmas cookies. On top of that, neighbors from up and down the street started knocking on our door in their 1s and 2s throughout the month of December, all bearing holiday gifts for the newest family on the block. By the time Christmas Eve rolled around, The pile of Christmas presents under our tree had progressed from a humble collection of gift wrap boxes to a knee-high mountain range of smaller and larger packages, all stacked on top of one another. Our son was so excited to open all of his gifts the next morning, and as we laid him down to sleep that night, my wife and I shared a moment of appreciation over just how far we'd come. The vast majority of those gifts were addressed to our son, and by that point, there was so much money that we'd almost completely lost track of who'd given them to us. Some of the gifts had tags that said nothing but a name, be it mine, my wife's, or our son's, but even those were mostly addressed to the boy. I couldn't wait to see his face when we opened them all together. And as I lay in bed with my wife that night, I remember her frantically freeing up space on her phone so she could record the very frantic, paper-tearing festivities in high-definition widescreen. There was, however, one little gift wrap box under that tree that was addressed to me. But if I'd have known what was in it, there's no way I'd have gotten even a wink of sleep that night. We don't know how long it had been sitting there, not exactly anyway. My wife and I don't remember seeing it in anybody's hand, nor did we recognize the handwriting on the tag. And so, as I opened it, I had no idea what it might be, or who it might be from. But as I tore off the wrapping paper and took off the box's lid, it wasn't a gift that I was opening. It was a wound. I didn't open any of my gifts right away. I was having too much fun watching our son open his. After that, I made my wife and I some coffee, and then we started working our way through the remaining gifts, until finally I was faced with a small rectangular box about the size of a Pringles can, which had a tag with my name on it, and the giver hadn't left their name. And unlike most of the other gifts, which had been wrapped in colorful patterned festive theme paper, the plain paper on this one was a dull mustard yellow. And after my wife suggested I open it, I remember giving the box a very theatrical shake. Whatever was inside wasn't heavy, and from the shape of the box, I figured that it might have been some bougie lambswool socks, of which I am very much a fan. But when I removed the yellow wrapping paper and gently pulled away the box's lid, I think I just froze. My wife later told me that, at first, she thought it was some hideously expensive silk tie, as one of my dreams is to actually own a silk tie from London's Turnbull. And a sere, and she says my face just went blank as I stared at the object in the box. Then, before she got up off the couch and walked over to see what it was, I closed the lid, shook my head, and began shakily whispering no as I gently prevented her from taking it. I'm currently writing from the perspective of my wife because my own recollection of those events is somewhat hazy, and I remember unwrapping the plain yellow gift wrap, opening up the box, and seeing an old, grimy-looking Barbie doll sitting inside. And then after that, everything gets a little foggy. The next thing I remember is the brandy burning my taste buds, while my wife asked me what was wrong. And it was impossible to say it at first. I didn't want to believe it was real, and saying it out loud seemed like a cursed incantation that had dragged the concept through the ether of possibility and firmly into reality. But in the end, I had to tell her. The old Barbie doll in the fancy gift wrap box had belonged to my little sister, who, as I said earlier, died many years earlier under tragic circumstances. But that term, tragic circumstances, was little more than a cuddly euphemism for what had actually happened. My sister hadn't just died. She hadn't succumbed to some rare disease or been involved in a horrible accident. My little sister had been abducted and murdered back when I was just 7 years old. My dad drove me over to the mall one Saturday to pick up a new pair of sneakers. Afterwards, we were set to go meet my mom and sister at a playground in our local park. But when we arrived, the first thing I remember noticing was how half a dozen cop cars were parked in the lot that we turned into, and how the officers that rode in them were talking to lots of worried-looking people. But without a doubt, the most worried-looking of all was my own mother. Just around the corner from the playground was a snack stall set into a large wooden area, and at some point, My sister complained of being thirsty, so Mom walked her to the area to grab some juice and a few snacks. My little sister proceeded to then drop her juice box on the ground, covering the straw in dirt, and then promptly burst into tears. They were only maybe 20 or 30 feet away from the area when this happened, so my mom heads back to the stall to buy another juice box. And explaining this has my sister going from straight-up wailing to just sniffling as she agrees to stay put. Mom said the only reason that she felt comfortable turning her back and leaving her there was the fact that there were, quite literally, dozens of other people there at the time. The playground was a popular spot for young parents, especially in the summertime, and everyone seemed to look out for one another's kids. But then, somehow, my little sister became the one exception, the one who fell through the cracks of what up until that point had been a pretty good system. Because after Mom bought that juice box and turned around, my little sister was gone. The cops spent the next couple of hours searching the park for her, praying she'd just gotten herself lost, and nothing sinister was to blame. But their prayers were wasted. Her body was found that night, lying among a patch of trees on the other side of the park, and she'd been stripped, tortured, and then strangled. And her murder has gone unsolved. According to Mom, my sister had brought her Barbie doll to the park with her that day to show off the haircut that she and Mom had given to it. They'd shortened the doll's waist-length hair to sit just above her shoulders, just like my sister's was. And she was pretty fond of her new personalized toy. When they found my sister's body, her clothes were lying in a neat folded pile nearby, but her customized Barbie doll was nowhere to be found. The cops began to suspect the doll had been taken as a kind of souvenir or trophy, and it quickly became a case of find the doll and you'll find the killer. The Barbie doll in the yellow gift wrap box had the exact same haircut, and I was also willing to bet that the dirt and grime encrusting its now pale blonde hair was from the very same park my sister was murdered in. My wife suggested that it might have been someone's idea of a sick joke, or that maybe someone wanted to hurt me. I mean, really hurt me by opening up an old wound. A lot of the information regarding my sister's disappearance is freely available through old newspapers and public records, so there was a chance someone had gone through the archives or police records and then come up with this sinister way to rattle me. But over the course of the next few weeks, that wishful theory was proven definitively false. I contacted the police the following morning, and within a week, the doll was being analyzed by forensic scientists over in some lab near Baton Rouge. And when I got the call from the detective that we'd been speaking with, the first thing he said after confirming my identity was, "You might want to be sitting down for this." I remember dragging a chair across the kitchen to where our phone was mounted on a wall, and as the detective talked, my wife had her ear pressed up against the handset, like we were conjoined twins attached at the scalp. And the forensic people had completed a full analysis of the doll, and this is what they'd concluded. Firstly, the fact that so much forensic evidence was still present on the doll suggested that someone had made every effort to preserve the state in which it was found. Soil samples matched those from the park my sister went missing from. And despite even the most complete fingerprints being next to unusable, they quite clearly belonged to a child of around 4 or 5 years old. One of the forensic scientists suggested that since the doll had been so well preserved for 30 years, there was a chance its adopted owner was familiar with forensic sciences. He'd certainly needed to have treated the doll with great care and reverence to have maintained its condition. But to the detectives, and to me, that only meant one thing. It had been a kind of trophy. And it was so much more than that, too. Its owner had sought to preserve not just an object, but a moment in time. And that moment was one in which he'd taken my sister's life. The detectives talked to every single adult that had been in our home over the month of December, and then went through hours of footage from the security camera that watched them all arrive. And not one of them was carrying a yellow rectangular box, not visibly anyway. And despite a thorough examination of the box and wrapping paper, Neither could be traced to purchases at any local stores. It was frustrating, and I can't help but commend the cops on what a thorough job they did. But in the end, we were all forced to accept that there was no way of knowing who had placed the yellow box under our tree, or how they'd done so. The only thing that they were certain of was that without evidence of some kind of break-in from that month of December, they had no choice but to conclude that, in all likelihood, the person who had placed the box under our tree had done so under the guise of a friendly Christmas visit. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that I handled it well, that I made my mom and dad proud and didn't let it get to me. But I can't say that. I can't say that at all. Obsessing over who had put my sister's doll under my tree and how they'd managed to get it there without me knowing it quite literally drove me crazy for a little while. I had to check myself into the Towel Center, which is sort of like a high-end psychiatric hospital near Baton Rouge, with the doctors and nurses slowly piecing me back together like an old jigsaw puzzle. They'd help me find myself again, but there's one thing they couldn't help me with, and that was trusting people. The only person I trusted in the whole world was my wife, and even then, there were 1 or 2 moments when I wondered, really wondered, if she was somehow involved in the murder of my little sister 30 years before. That was me at the worst, though, right before I called that center. But after I got out, it took less than 6 months for me to move us all out of state and to start a whole new life someplace else. Now, I know that might sound a little radical, but with the age of our son, it was either do it then and find a top-tier school district in our prospective new home, or wait years and risk uprooting our son's social life. My wife made excuses to our family for me, saying that we had to move for my job, and I just didn't have the heart to tell anyone I didn't trust them anymore. But to me, that's a contender for the worst aspect of this entire story, rivaling even that of my sister's murder. You see, whoever killed her, it felt like they won for a while. They took my sister, waited 30 goddamned years, and then successfully induced a mental breakdown before destroying my life as I knew it. It's like they waited for decades, patiently biding their time, until I finally started to reclaim the holidays from pain and misery, and then they took it all away again. These days, we vacation in Mexico over the holidays. My son's 15 now, and he and his little sister are more accustomed to tamales than turkey and potatoes. And we love it down there. It's just enough of the holidays for the kids to enjoy it, and it's just different enough that it doesn't remind me of things from the past. I still think of my sister every so often, and of my mother and father. But these days, with me reminding my son to take care of his little sister, it doesn't feel like my own sister's killer is quite so victorious anymore. Story 2. LRA attack on African village on Christmas Day. Christmas morning in our small village of F was supposed to be a day of celebration, prayer, and gathering with family. We had planned to attend church, eat together, and celebrate the birth of Jesus. Instead, it became the day our lives were torn apart. A day that, when I think of it now, I am reminded of the smell of burning, as if the air itself wanted to suffocate our very spirit. I had been up before sunrise, helping my mother prepare cassava and beans for the Christmas feast. My younger brother Kaizo, who had just turned 8, was outside kicking his new football back and forth with our father. He was so happy with his new ball, not just because it was a gift, but because he and his friends would be able to play together. Our father joked that one day he would become a great footballer and travel to Europe and make lots of money. We laughed, and the future seemed so bright. We had no idea of the terror that marched towards us. The first warning came as a distant rumble, sort of like thunder, but the skies were blue and clear. We thought it might be herds of cattle or the wind in the trees. It wasn't until we heard the unmistakable crack of gunfire that we realized something was terribly wrong. The LRA had come. They descended on our village like rabid animals, shooting their weapons as they ran. There were at least 20 to 30 of them, young men with violence in their eyes and war paint on their faces. Some carried machine guns, machetes, and others carried clubs studded with nails and chunks of iron. They barely looked like human beings anymore as they charged, shouting in a language that I didn't understand. But somehow, I knew what they were saying. They were screaming of killing, violating, torturing, and destroying us. We tried to run, but where could we go? The village was surrounded by very thick forest, and the attackers were able to move much faster. I grabbed Kizo's hand, dragging him toward the church, thinking that it might be a place of refuge. But as we reached the steps, we saw bodies sprawled across the ground. Men, women, and children all lay dead. The LRA had shown them no mercy. I froze, my grip tightening on Kizo's hand. He had no idea what was happening and kept asking me, "Sister, what's going on?" I knew, but I didn't have the words or the heart to tell him. When the LRA soldiers cornered an uncle from our village, he tried to reason with them and then begged for mercy. He stepped forward, hands raised, as he pled for his life. But one of the rebels shot him in the chest without hesitation. The rebels laughed as he died, a chilling sound that I'll never forget. After that, the LRA rounded up those of us who remained and forced us to kneel in the dirt. One of the soldiers, who looked to be their leader, shouted something and pointed at the group. They began to separate us men from women, adults from children. My father was among the men. He looked at me one last time, his eyes full of fear and love, before they marched him away with the others. I never saw them again. The women and children were then taken to the church. The rebels had turned it into a sort of slaughterhouse. They set fire to that building, forcing us to watch as flames consumed our sanctuary. Anyone who tried to escape was hacked down with machetes or shot. I remember clutching Kizo tightly, trying to shield him from the horrors around us. But how could I protect him? The rebels were like devils, and they took pleasure in our suffering, laughing as they mutilated us and killing whoever they pleased. Kizo was crying. He trembled as I held him. One of the rebels noticed us and approached, holding a machete. He grabbed Kizo by the arm and pulled him away from me. I screamed, begged, and pleaded, but the man hit me very hard in the face with his rifle. My vision blurred as I watched him drag Kizo away. The last thing I remember before I passed out were his screams. Somehow, I survived that day, but I don't know why. Perhaps the rebels thought that I was dead after they struck me, or perhaps God spared me for a reason I can't yet understand. When I woke up, the village was silent except for the crackling of flames and the occasional cry of a wounded survivor. The rebels were gone, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. I stumbled through the village, calling out for Kizo, for my mother, for anyone. But the only answers were the moans of those dying. The church was just a ruin, its charred skeleton standing as a grim reminder of what had happened. Bodies were strewn everywhere, some mutilated beyond recognition. I found my mother among them, her lifeless eyes staring to the sky. I collapsed beside her and began to cry. Kizo was nowhere to be found. I searched for days, scouring the forests and surrounding villages, but found no trace of him. I can only hope that he's still alive somewhere, though deep down, I fear the worst. The rebels are known for abducting children and either enslaving them or forcing them to become child soldiers, which in many ways is a fate worse than death. It's been years since that Christmas, but the wounds have not healed. I still see the faces of the dead in my dreams. I hear their screams, smell the smoke, and feel the heat of the flames on my face. I wonder why the world did nothing to stop this, why we were left to suffer alone. The LRA have been terrorizing our region for a long time, and for a while, many people in the West spoke of ending the LRA in 2012. But now that is not fashionable anymore, and no one seems to care. Do our lives not matter anymore? Did you throw us away for next year's fashion, I send my story not because I want pity. Instead, I want the world to know what happened. I want people to remember the lives that were lost and the families that were torn apart. I want justice and peace for my village, for my family, for Kizo, and for generations to come. Story 3. Cyclone Tracy, Australia. 1974. Christmas of 1974 had been a sweltering one here on Australia's northern coast. I was 32 years old at the time, a young mother with 2 children, Sarah and Jacob, aged 6 and 4. By Christmas Eve, both my kids were super excited for the arrival of Santa Claus. I was chock-a-block that day, with stuff that I still had to get done. But all the while, I kept hearing things that made me a little bit nervous. Reports of an incoming cyclone had been circulating, but most of us brushed them off. Cyclones aren't unheard of around that time of year, but they mostly veered off or dissipated before causing serious damage. What often started as a cyclone warning mostly ended up being a little bit of wind and rain, and very little else. But as the evening sky hung low with a deceptive stillness, we allowed ourselves to be lulled into a false sense of security. That evening, we celebrated Christmas with neighbors. The kids were excited, running around in their new pajamas, while the adults shared drinks, laughed under the glow of the Christmas lights. By midnight, the wind had picked up, rattling windows and bending palm trees. My husband Peter had turned on the radio for updates, and the reports were concerning. But still no one seemed to grasp the enormity of what was coming. By 2 in the morning, the winds had intensified, howling like a wild animal outside our home. The rain came in torrents, hammering the roof with a deafening roar. We moved the kids into our bedroom, thinking it was probably safer there, and huddled together. The power went out soon after, plunging us into complete darkness, and the only light came from flashes of lightning that illuminated the chaos that was going on outside. Flying debris, bending trees, and collapsing structures. Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash as our living room window shattered, spraying glass across the floor. The wind tore through the house, ripping curtains from their rods and flinging furniture across the room. Peter shouted over the noise, "Get to the bathroom!" We grabbed the children and ran. The bathroom was small, but it felt like a fortress compared to the rest of the house. Peter pushed the mattress against the door as a makeshift barricade, while I held the children close, whispering reassurances that I myself didn't believe. The walls shook violently, and it felt as if the entire house might be torn apart at any moment. But then suddenly, an uneasy calm settled over us. The wind abruptly stopped. We hesitated, unsure of what to do, and Peter then peeked out and said, "We're in the eye. Come on, we don't have much time." Then, despite my protest, he ran outside to check on the neighbors. The devastation was staggering. Entire houses had been flattened, and the streets were unrecognizable, buried under piles of debris. Cars had been overturned, crushed under falling trees, and the air was thick with a smell of salt water, mud, and destruction. Some neighbors were wandering dazed, their faces streaked with blood and disbelief. Others were calling out for loved ones, their voices tinged with shock or panic. Peter returned quickly, urging us to stay put. The calm lasted barely 20 minutes before the winds returned, this time from the opposite direction. It was even fiercer than before, as if the cyclone was determined to finish us all off. Rain poured in, soaking us to the bone. Before our bathroom door buckled under the pressure and the roof began to peel away, one sheet of metal at a time, I remember clinging to Sarah and Jacob, shielding them as best I could. The sound was almost indescribable. It was like a cacophony of screeching metal, crashing timber, all wrapped up in this relentless howl of the wind. There came a point where my ears popped from the pressure, and I could feel the vibrations of the storm in my chest. Time lost all meaning, and it felt like an eternity before the winds finally began to subside. When dawn broke, we emerged from the bathroom, and what greeted us was a scene of utter devastation. Our home, like so many others, was barely standing. The roof was gone, and most of the walls had collapsed. The kitchen was unrecognizable, buried under a mountain of debris. When we stepped outside, we were met with the full extent of the destruction. Darwin looked like a war zone. Not a single structure seemed untouched. Trees were uprooted, power lines dangled precariously, and the streets were littered with fragments of lives, things like clothing, toys, even the odd family photograph. The air was thick with the cries of the injured and the calls of those searching for loved ones. My heart sank as I saw neighbors helping each other sift through rubble, hoping to find survivors. Miraculously, our family was unharmed, but many others were not so lucky. More than 70 people lost their lives that night, and many others were injured or made homeless by what came to be known as Cyclone Tracy. In the days that followed, the scale of the disaster became clear. Cyclone Tracy had obliterated over 70% of Darwin's buildings, leaving tens of thousands homeless. The government declared a state of emergency and began evacuating residents. We were among those airlifted out, taking only what we could carry. Saying goodbye to the place that we called home was heartbreaking, but we had no choice. Rebuilding Darwin was a monumental task, and some people said it would take years. But the spirit of our community never wavered. People came together, offered support and kindness in the face of unimaginable loss. We shared food, water, and stories, finding comfort in each other. And that night is something I'll never forget. Even now, the sound of the wind gets my heart racing, and the smell of rain takes me right back to those awful hours. But I also think about how our community pulled together, finding strength when we needed it most. Cyclone Tracy was devastating, but it brought out the best in people kindness, bravery, and the determination to rebuild. It has been nearly 50 years since then. Darwin has grown into a strong, thriving city, built to stand up against whatever comes next. But for those of us who were there, Tracy isn't just history. It's part of our story. I shared this not to dwell on the pain, but to remember those we lost and honor the strength of those who survived. Nature is powerful, but so is the human spirit. Story 4. Garbage truck crash in Glasgow. It was supposed to be a joyful day, just 3 days before Christmas, with the streets buzzing with last-minute shoppers. I'd finished work early, and had decided to head down into town to grab a coffee and watch the skaters on the ice rink in George Square before heading home. The square is the absolute heart of Glasgow during the Christmas period, alive with families and couples and groups of friends, all bundled up against the cold. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine from nearby stalls, and as I walked, I was reminded of just how special that time of year can be. I turned onto Queen Street, walking in the direction of George Square, soaking up the festive atmosphere. And then it happened. Looking back on it, I think I noticed the bin lorry before most did. It seemed out of place, and something about the way it lumbered along just didn't seem right to me. It was veering ever so slightly, and wasn't following the usual stop-start rhythm of city center traffic. At first, I thought maybe the driver was in a rush somewhere, or perhaps a wee bit overeager to finish the day's work before his Christmas break. But then it swerved. The lorry crossed over the curb, mounting the pavement, and that's when it all kicked off. The massive green monstrosity of a truck careened towards the crowds on Queen Street, leaving people with no time at all to react. Some froze in shock, others tried to run, pulling their kids along with them as they did. But the truck was moving too fast and moved too unpredictably, and they didn't stand a chance. I remember hearing a woman scream, my eyes darting toward her for a split second before they locked back on the lorry. I then gasped in horror as it smashed into street furniture. First a bench, then a row of bins, and it just kept going, completely unstoppable. Glass shattered as it clipped a shop window, and the sound of metal screeching against metal was near deafening. Panic spread like wildfire, and people shouted warnings, trying in vain to get innocent bystanders out of the way in time. At one point, I saw a young lad grab an elderly woman off the pavement just in time. The lorry must have missed them by inches. Others weren't so fortunate. I then watched the lorry plow through a group of people, and I'll never forget the way their bodies bumped into each other, knocking each other over like bowling pins. Some people were hit so hard it took them right out of their shoes, and people kept screaming for the driver to stop, but it was like he couldn't hear us. The truck barreled through Queen Street, turning into George Square. My feet carried me forward instinctively, following, and I felt powerless. I just needed to know what was happening. When I reached the square, the scene was like something from a nightmare. It was supposed to be a place of joy, with fairy lights and the giant Christmas tree standing in the center, and instead, it was a scene of pure horror. After hitting a building, the lorry had finally stopped, but the damage had already been done. I saw a pram overturned near the Christmas market stalls, and a man knelt beside it as he checked on the child inside. The baby was crying, and I remember feeling a small twinge of relief as I realized it was still alive. People lay motionless on the ground, bystanders kneeling next to them to give them CPR. Others shouted desperately into their phones for ambulances to come quicker. I stood there, rooted to the spot, barely able to process what I was seeing, and then a man next to me said, "Bloody hell, that's like a war zone." And that's all I could do was agree. There was this horrible mix of groans, screams, and sirens wailing in the distance. I later learned that the driver had suffered some kind of medical emergency, a heart attack or a blackout or something like that, and lost control of the lorry. At the time, though, no one knew, and the not knowing made it all the worse. I found myself looking at a woman who sat on the ground, cradling another in her arms. The woman in her lap wasn't moving, her face pale, her lips slightly parted, as though she were about to speak. The first woman, maybe her friend, sister, or stranger, rocked back and forth, whispering, "It's going to be okay." But I could tell that she feared the worst. Police arrived quickly, cordoning off the area and ushering the uninjured away. They looked as shaken as we were, and so did the paramedics as they flooded the square and started loading people onto stretchers. It felt wrong to leave, but I wasn't helping by staying, so I moved to the edge of the square and stood beneath the massive Christmas tree until I was finally able to just leave. In the days that followed, details trickled out slowly on the news. 6 people dead, and many left with life-changing injuries. Glasgow was stunned, and tributes poured in for those that had lost their lives' flowers, and messages filling George Square. A vigil gathered to pay their respects, the crowd made up of survivors, bystanders, and well-wishers, all sharing their stories, all trying to make sense of what was impossible to make sense of. For weeks afterwards, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. I kept thinking about the young couple that I'd seen earlier, laughing together as they walked hand in hand down Queen Street. Were they okay? Had they made it out unscathed? And what about the woman with the pram? I still find myself asking those questions sometimes, even now, years later. I still make an effort to avoid George Square around Christmas time if possible. The city came together in the aftermath, as Glasgow always does, with a spirit of resilience and community. But the scars remain. For those of us who were there, the 22nd of December will never be just another day. Story 5. Tragedy at Italian Hall, Calumet, Michigan, 1913. It was Christmas Eve in Calumet, Michigan, and though times were hard, there was a buzz of excitement in the air for the miners and their families. This holiday gathering at the Italian Hall was a chance to escape the struggles of daily life, if only for a few hours. The strike had been dragging on for months, and tensions with the mining companies were high. Most of the men hadn't worked in weeks, and money was tight. But the Women's Auxiliary of the Western Federation of Miners had worked tirelessly to organize the party. They wanted to make sure the children had a reason to smile, even in the midst of such hardship. I arrived early with my sister Anna and her two little ones, Sophie and Peter. Sophie, who was just 5, clung to her mother's hand, her eyes wide, lighting up at the sight of the Christmas tree in the hall. It was a very grand tree, tall and sparkling with ornaments, standing in the corner of the large upstairs room where the party was held. The children's laughter filled that space, mingling with the hum of conversation and the melodies of carols played on a small, upright piano. The hall was packed, the wooden floor creaking under the weight of so many feet. Families crowded in, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their cheeks pink from the cold. Volunteers handed out candy and small gifts, little dolls, tin soldiers, and sweets wrapped in paper. For many of these children, it was the only Christmas gift they would receive that year. I remember watching Sophie and Peter join the other children near the tree, their faces alight with joy as they danced and played. I stood near the back with Anna, sipping hot coffee from a tin cup, my hands grateful for the warmth. The smell of pine mingled with the scent of damp wool coats and the faint aroma of food from the kitchen downstairs. And then it happened. It started with a voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the music and chatter. Fire! Fire! For a moment, everything froze. The music stopped, and silence fell over the crowd. Then, like a match struck in a dry forest, panic ignited. People screamed, and the room seemed to shift all at once as the crowd surged toward the exit. I could see the stairs from where I stood, a single narrow flight leading down to the street, and it was the only way out. Anna grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear, and we pushed our way forward, struggling against the tide of bodies. People shouted and shoved, their faces wild with terror. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself it couldn't be true. There was no smell of smoke, no heat, no sign of fire. But the fear in the room was real, and it was spreading like wildfire. Sophie and Peter were near the tree when the panic started, but by the time we reached them, they were crying, clutching each other tightly. Anna scooped up Sophie, and I grabbed Peter's hand, pulling him close as we turned toward the exit. The stairs were a bottleneck, a mass of people crammed into the narrow space, all trying to escape at once. From where I stood, I could see the load of bodies piling up near the doorway. People fell, tripped, were trampled underfoot. The screams were deafening, a terrible chorus of desperation and fear. I held on to Peter's hand with all my strength, terrified of losing him in the crowd. Anna was just ahead of me, her face pale as she clutched Sophie to her chest. We inched forward, step by agonizing step, but the press of bodies was relentless. The air grew thick not with smoke, but with panic, and the suffocating heat of so many people packed together. Somewhere in the chaos, I heard someone shout, "There's no fire! It's a false alarm!" But it was too late. The fear had taken hold, and there was no stopping this tide. I don't know how long it took for us to reach the bottom of the stairs. It felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. By the time we stumbled out into the cold night air, my legs were trembling, and Peter was crying so hard he could barely breathe. Anna clutched Sophie tightly, her face streaked with tears. The street outside was chaos. People milled about, shouting names and looking for loved ones. Some stood in shock, staring at the hall's doorway where bodies were still wedged together, a terrible human barricade that had blocked the exit. I could hear the anguished cries of those still trapped inside. It wasn't until later that we learned the truth. There had been no fire, no danger, only a cruel prank. Someone, perhaps an agent of the mining companies, had shouted "fire" to create panic, knowing full well the chaos it would cause. And the narrow stairway had become a death trap. By the time it was over, 73 people were dead, most of them children. In the days that followed, the grief was unbearable. Funerals were held one after another, a grim procession of caskets too small to comprehend. The community was shattered, our collective heart broken by the senselessness of it all. I think about that night often, about the faces of the children who didn't make it out, their laughter silenced forever. I think about the cruel hand that caused it, and the lives it destroyed. And I think about Sophie and Peter, how close we came to losing them, and how fragile life can be. The Italian hall is gone now, torn down years later, but the memory remains. A simple archway stands in its place, a stark reminder of that terrible night. Every Christmas Eve, I light a candle for those we lost, and I hold my family close, grateful for every moment we have together. Story 6. Nashville Tragedy, Christmas 2021. Christmas morning in Nashville was supposed to be quiet. I had been looking forward to a slow start to the day, sipping coffee, while the rest of the city still slept off the festivities of Christmas Eve. Living downtown had its perks. Broadway with its honky-tonks and neon lights was just a few blocks away, but mornings were usually peaceful. And that was until the chaos began. I woke up at around 5:30 a.m., startled by a strange noise. It wasn't the usual hum of the city. It was a series of rapid pops like gunfire echoing down the street. At first, I thought maybe someone had a little too much to drink the night before and was setting off firecrackers. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It was sharper, louder, and more deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me. I threw on a coat over my pajamas and stepped out onto the balcony of my second-story apartment, which overlooks 2nd Avenue North. The street was quiet, unusually so. In the crisp morning air carried a sort of eerie stillness, and then I saw it. A large white recreational vehicle parked in the middle of the street, right outside the AT&T building. The RV looked out of place. It was an older model, not the type of vehicle you'd expect to see downtown, especially on Christmas morning. But what struck me even more was the sound coming from it. A recorded voice echoed through the street, calm and robotic, repeating the same message over and over. "This area must be evacuated now. This area must be evacuated now." I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, a warning on Christmas morning. A few other neighbors had come out onto their balconies or peered through their windows, their faces as confused as mine. One man down the street stepped outside and shouted toward the RV, but the voice continued its loop, unbothered. Minutes later, the message changed. The same monotone voice announced, "This vehicle will explode in 15 minutes. This vehicle will explode in 15 minutes." My heart dropped. This wasn't a prank or some bizarre holiday stunt. This was serious. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the line was already flooded. I could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder. Panic started to set in. I ran back inside, shaking my roommate awake, telling her that we had to go. Grabbing my keys and throwing on shoes, she was groggy, confused, but the urgency in my voice snapped her into action. We rushed down the stairs and out the back of the building, joining a small crowd of people already gathering in the alley behind our complex. The police were arriving now, the blue and red lights cutting through the dim morning light. Officers shouted for people to move further back, urging everyone to clear the area. I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing one officer running door to door, pounding on them, yelling for residents to evacuate. The recorded warning was still playing, that calm, robotic tone juxtaposed against the rising panic in the streets. 10 minutes, it said, and we were several blocks away when it happened. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the RV exploded. The blast was deafening, a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath us. I remember ducking instinctively, covering my head, as a massive fireball lit up the sky. The shock wave hit seconds later, rattling windows and setting off car alarms for blocks. When I looked up, a thick plume of black smoke was rising from where the RV had been, twisting into the sky like some terrible omen, darkening the already overcast morning. Pieces of debris rained down, and a terrible smell of burning metal and chemicals filled the air. The crowd around me was stunned into silence. Some people were crying, Others clutched their phones, frantically calling loved ones. A man nearby muttered, "Oh my God," over and over again, his hand shaking. I turned my gaze back towards 2nd Avenue, and even from where we stood, the destruction was visible. The explosion had torn through the street, leaving a jagged crater where the RV once was. Buildings on either side were heavily damaged, their facades blown apart and windows shattered. Smoke billowed from several storefronts, and I could see flames flickering in the rubble. The eerie thing was how empty the street was. If it hadn't been for the warning, the casualties would have been unthinkable. It was Christmas morning, a time when the city was usually quiet, but still, it was downtown Nashville. Any other day, the street would have been bustling with people. Emergency services were on the scene within minutes, firefighters rushing to contain the flames while police taped off the area. They moved quickly, but the devastation was overwhelming. As the morning wore on, more details began to emerge. Officials confirmed it was a deliberate act, a targeted bombing. They speculated that the AT&T building had been the intended target, as the explosion had disrupted telecommunications across the region. Cell service was down, internet was spotty, and people couldn't even make emergency calls. The bomber, it turned out, a man named Anthony Quinn Warner, had stayed inside the RV. The FBI identified him within days through DNA found at the scene. He had planned everything meticulously, right down to the warning message that had undoubtedly saved lives. But why he did it, and why he chose Christmas, and why he targeted Nashville, remained a mystery. For days after, the city felt different. 2nd Avenue, usually vibrant and full of life, was sectioned off, a haunting reminder of what had happened. News crews descended on the area, their cameras capturing the destruction. Residents left flowers and notes at the barricades, small gestures of resilience in the face of tragedy. I still think about that morning often, about how close we came to disaster. The destruction was devastating, but it could have been so much worse. The bomber's warning gave people time to escape, but the psychological scars remain. Every time I hear a loud noise downtown, I flinch, my mind flashing back to that moment. The blast, the smoke, the chaos. Christmas will never feel the same for me, not after that day. It's a reminder of how fragile things can be, how quickly everything can change. But it's also a testament to the strength of the city, to the way people come together in the face of tragedy. Story 6. Tangiwai Rail Disaster, New Zealand, 1953. It was Christmas Eve of 1953. The night was warm and clear, and there was a sense of quiet excitement in the air as we boarded the Wellington to Auckland Express train. I was traveling with my younger sister Margaret to spend Christmas with our parents in Auckland. She was just 16, full of life and enthusiasm, her laughter brightening the crowded carriage. I was 21 and had recently started working in Wellington, so this was a rare chance for us to spend time together. The train had a bunch of families, couples, and travelers heading home for the holidays. Our carriage was packed with chatter and the rustling of parcels. Christmas gifts wrapped with care. I remember the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the sort of comforting sound that seemed to harmonize with the festive mood inside the train. As the hours passed, the passengers settled into a sort of lull. Margaret and I dozed in our seats, lulled by the steady motion of the train. It must have been close to midnight when I was jolted awake by a strange sensation. The train, which had been moving smoothly moments before, began to sway and jolt unnaturally. At first I thought it might just be a sharp curve in the tracks, but the jerking became more violent, and the carriage seemed to lurch sideways. Suddenly, there was this loud roar, like the earth itself had split open. The lights in the carriage flickered, and then went out, plunging us all into darkness. People screamed, and I felt Margaret's hand grip mine tightly, her voice trembling with fear. "What's happening?" she cried out. But I didn't have an answer. In the chaos, the train came to a grinding halt, but not in the way that it should have. Instead of stopping smoothly, there was a gut-wrenching sensation of falling. The carriage tilted sharply, and people and luggage were thrown against one another. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood filled the air as the train plunged into the icy waters below. I don't remember the exact moment we hit the river, but the impact was like being struck by a massive wave. Water surged into the carriage, freezing and relentless, rising quickly and swallowing everything in its path. The screams of the passengers turned into gasps and cries for help as the freezing current engulfed us. I yelled for Margaret, but my voice was drowned out by the chaos. I could feel her hand slip from mine as the water surged between us. Panic set in as I struggled to keep my head above water. The overturned carriage was like a coffin, dark, cold, and the air quickly became unbreathable. Somehow, I managed to find an opening, a broken window or door, and clawed my way onto the rushing river. The icy water was a shock, numbing my limbs and stealing my breath, but I forced myself to swim toward what I thought was the riverbank. Around me, I could hear the cries of other survivors, their voices mingling with the roar of the river. When I finally crawled onto the muddy bank, shivering and exhausted, I looked back at the wreckage, and it was terrifying. The Wangehu River was a raging torrent, a deadly mix of volcanic debris and water rushing down from Mount Ruapehu's crater lake. The bridge had been completely destroyed, its supports washed away by the force of the lahar just moments before the train arrived. Most of the carriages were submerged or swept downstream, their occupants trapped inside. I searched desperately for Margaret, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. Other survivors were doing the same, some wading into the water to try and pull people from the wreckage, others sobbing in despair. A few locals had arrived, drawn by the noise, and they helped pull the injured to safety. The night was filled with the sound of crying, shouting, and the relentless roar of the river. As dawn broke, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. Bodies were being pulled from the wreckage, their lifeless forms laid out on the muddy banks. The Christmas gifts that had filled the train were scattered across the river. The bright wrapping paper, a tragic contrast to the grim scene. The air was heavy with the smell of mud, and the cries of those searching for loved ones echoed in the still morning. I found Margaret later that day, her body caught in a tangle of debris downstream. She looked peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping, but the sight of her broke me in a way that I cannot describe. I sat beside her, holding her cold hand, and whispering apologies for not being able to save her. In the days that followed, the tragedy of Tangiwai dominated the news. We learned that the lahar had struck the bridge just minutes before the train arrived, weakening its structure until it gave way under the weight of the locomotive. There had been no warning, no chance for the train to stop in time. Of the 285 passengers on board, 151 lost their lives. In the years since, I've often wondered why I survived when so many others didn't. The memories of that night still haunt me. The sound of the river, the cries for help, the sight of my sister's lifeless body. But I also remember the bravery and kindness of those who came to our aid. The locals who risked their lives to save strangers. The resilience of the survivors who refused to give up. The Tangiwai disaster changed my life forever. It took my sister, shattered my family, and left scars that will never fully heal. But it also taught me the value of each moment we spend in the company of those we love and cherish.